Walking a path along the roots of Pikes Peak, you take a fork in the road to the Anselm Society Digital Pub. Inside is a raucous conversation on the arts, faith, and the proper colors to assign to each line of Psalm 23. At a corner table by the fire are three people. One of them is saying that the cup runneth over line should be purple, maybe red. Anyway, that's me, Matthew Mullema, and welcome to Believe to See, a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. Here at Believe to See, we explore the relationship between faith, art, and storytelling. Our goal is to help you connect the great story, the great stories, and our own story in order to understand what it means to live with a Christian imagination. Now, I've heard it said somewhere on the internet generally that if you're a writer or artist or have some other business which depends upon regular customers, you should shoot for having at least 250 super fans. You know who I'm talking about. The fans who love your work so much that they'll buy whatever you create every single time. Well, I don't know the exact number of super fans which Danielle Hitchens has, but given her success, I'm guessing it's a good number. One thing I do know for certain, though, is that she has at least one superfan, my wife, Danielle Mullema. Danielle Hitchens' first book came out around the time our oldest child was born. And that's fortunate timing, because her books were geared toward young children. Specifically, her first book was a counting primer and a way to introduce very young kids to the basics of the Christian faith. Now, through the years, more books have followed, primers on everything from colors to shapes to different parts of the body. And accompanying all of those were lessons on the Christian faith as well. If you'd like to review a full catalog of Danielle Hitchens' works, just look at the bookshelf in the Mullema house. But now, Danielle Hitchens is taking her writing in a completely new direction. Sort of. Or maybe it's a logical extension of what she's already been writing. Well, at any rate, her new book is called Sacred Seasons, and I'm really excited to talk about it. And so is the other Danielle, my wife Danielle Mullema, who's joining me. Hello, Danielle.
Hey, sweetie. It's fun to be here.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for agreeing to co-host with me.
I would not miss it. I am a super fan, as you say.
It is really a rhythm where my Danielle will be like, hey, Danielle Hitchens has a new book out, so I already ordered it. I'm like, great. And it's really that simple. Danielle Hitchens, who is joining us, I hope you realize how easy your profit is every time you have a book from the Mullema household.
Well, what an amazing introduction. Thank you so much. Thank you for supporting my work for the last almost 7 years. I'm just honored to be on with you guys today.
Well, we are very happy to have you on today. So let's start off by talking about your upcoming book, Sacred Seasons, which is due to be out October 3rd. So depending on when this will end up posting, it'll probably be a few weeks from when this posts. So why don't you give us the basic 30,000 foot elevator pitch? What is Sacred Seasons about?
Sacred Seasons is a family guide to help you center your whole year around Jesus. So basically, this book is about the liturgical year. And for those who aren't familiar with that, it is the way that the church has kept time for almost 2,000 years. From the time that Easter began being celebrated in the first century, not too long after Christ's crucifixion, his disciples would gather and celebrate Easter. All the way up until the institution of Christ the King Sunday in the early 20th century, the church has found a way to keep time with the life of Christ. And we do this by tracking Christ's life through various seasons, things you may have heard of, like Advent and Christmas, or things maybe that are less familiar to people, like Candlemas, or some of the different feast saint days. And this is just a way of helping us orient our entire year around Jesus. Instead of around an academic calendar or a work schedule, we make Jesus the center of our time and our family's life and let everything else be built around him. And I personally found this to be such a wonderful and helpful practice in my own family, a great way to just rehearse the great story of God with my kids, for myself, with my husband, over and over and over again. And I pray that this way of keeping time with the Lord will be a blessing to other families as well.
Awesome. And I am very, very excited to get to Sacred Seasons, but let's start off. In case the listeners aren't familiar with the other books you were writing, the primers I was talking about. So let's just take a quick quick tour through those. Tell us how you started into that area, and also you may notice in my intro I had a little teaser where it's like, is Sacred
I was
Seasons
wondering if we need to get back to this.
is it one continuous process from those, or do you think there's a little bit of a bridge? So let's go through the journey, starting with the counting primer.
First Bible basics. Yeah. So when my oldest child, who is now 9, was about 18 months old, somebody asked me what I was doing for her spiritual development. And I thought, I am keeping her alive. But we loved to read to her. We had this great book series, the Baby Lit Primers. And if you're a great books nerd, you would love the Baby Lit Primers. And we would count through Pride and Prejudice, One English Village, Two Rich Gentlemen, Three Big Houses, Five Sisters, 10,000 pounds, and I just delighted in the cleverness of this book. And I was like, oh, somebody should make baby lit books for theology. And I was like, haha, wouldn't that be a great idea? And I kind of let it go. And then it's like, that's actually a really good idea. Surely somebody has done this. And I dug through all the parts of the internet where I thought I could possibly find Christian books for kids and could not find anything. And then I thought, well, you know what? I bet I could do this. So I sat down and I wrote a couple of different primer style manuscripts, and I found an illustrator and thought, here goes nothing. And the Lord was really faithful during that process to provide all that we needed. And we published our first book on Kickstarter back in 2016. And I just remember sitting in front of my computer the day we launched, sobbing my eyes out, watching the total tick up from $0 to $5,000 on the first day, and going, this is actually a need. There are parents who are hungry to teach their children something that goes beyond Bible stories to theology. And then I was happy to partner with Harvest House after that, and they have helped me produce the next 9 books in the series. So there's something for everyone. If you want anatomy, if you want opposites, if you want ABCs, you can find that in my series. I won't bore you with the list of book titles at this point. Just go to the Melamas. They can show you all of them.
We've got them all.
So to your question about the bridge between the Baby Believer series and Sacred Seasons, which I agree are very different projects on their face. Catechesis Books, which is my sort of company, my brand name, has always been about nurturing the blossoming soul, providing materials to nurture the blossoming soul, and helping people understand by a process of catechesis, which can be through prayer, through formal learning, through a catechism, through scripture, through spiritual disciplines, how they become shaped more and more into the image of Jesus. So in one sense, Sacred Seasons fits directly within the goals that Catechesis Books has always had. In terms of subject matter, though, I started to be interested in this work for my own family, the spiritual discipline of the church here for my own family. And so I began posting about it more and more on my public Instagram account. And it turns out that I'm not the only parent who is hungry for ways to shape my family's life around Christ. And as I began writing about this, I realized that I just have a real passion for sharing about this spiritual discipline with other families, as well as observing it in my own family. And Harvest House saw the hunger there, and they offered me a book contract on this subject. And here we are 2.5 years later. I originally wrote a 100,000 word manuscript and had to cut it down to 50. So you can thank Harvest House that this book isn't 600 pages. But there's really a lot there. It's a beautiful tradition.
Well, it is way better to be in a position where you've written 100,000 words and need to cut it down to 50 than be like, oh, I have 20,000 words, I need to bulk it up. So you're in the right spot if you end up overshooting. Yeah.
That's great. So you have commented before that children really naturally love liturgies. Why is that, and how have you seen that play out as you all invite your kids into this story of Christ's redemption?
So, when you're an adult, you don't consider how foreign the world is to a child. They're short. They can't see over the kitchen counter. They don't have access to things. Their food is mostly regulated, and where they go is mostly regulated, and how their house is decorated and the toys they have is mostly regulated. And they just don't have a lot of control necessarily over their lives. So a habit, a liturgy, is something that kids love because it makes them feel like they have mastery over something. And I know to varying degrees, different children like to have control over things. And I've seen this in my own kids. We run the gamut from pretty easygoing to like needs to know exactly what we're doing every minute of every day. And so a liturgy just allows for that kind of knowledge and understanding and mastery. And kids know what's coming next, what they're going to look forward to. And so the church year has helped us shape our big picture calendar around Christ's life so that my kids ask things like, when is Advent coming? When do we get to make St. Lucy's buns? When do we get to decorate the tree? Are you going to make king cake? When are we making candles for Candlemas? Do we get to get ashes on our head this year? And so they are starting to track Christ's life through these fun and interesting things that we do. We can talk about the waiting time at Advent and how we're preparing for Christ to arrive. And we can talk about the arrival of the Magi when we eat the king cake and the gifts that they brought to Jesus. And it's just been such a beautiful way to help them gain mastery of the big story of the Bible, to help them understand the way that Christian ties into how the ways that we form our lives. And they're asking deeper and deeper questions. They're also retelling me that story each year, which is beautiful. I love when they bring something up that I forgot. I'm like, oh, don't you remember this part of the story? I'm like, oh yeah, that's a great part of the story. How can I forget it? And it's just such a lovely way to engage in the big story of the Bible with my kids.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah, we've definitely seen that in our own family too. And I think kids also, actually all people, we make meaning through story. It's how we're able to piece together our world. And as of late, my kids have really loved hearing their birth stories. I'm not sure exactly what brought this on, but they will specifically ask sometimes at a meal. And of course, if I do it for one child, I'm doing it for the other three as well. But at the end of the story, when like the first time I get to hold them, I always say, oh, and I looked at your face and I said, hey, it's you. It was you in there all along. I loved you the whole time. And if I say it different than that, they say, no, that's not right. That's not how the story goes. And I have to say it the right way, because story is really forming their view of themselves and their identity in a way that just, sharing like the facts of their birth cannot. And so so we've also really seen that, I think, in our family as we've kind of introduced them into this great story that they are being invited into. And it's honestly been beautiful for us as well, as two people who are not raised in the liturgical tradition. I feel like it's an opportunity for us to learn together and to really have a view of our lives and ourselves that just completely enmeshed with the story of the redemption of all things, and the fruit of that, even with the young ages of our kids, has been really beautiful.
I love that. I mean, it is beautiful to invite them into God's big story and help them find their place in it. And one thing I love about the liturgical year is that it has the high highs of humanity and the low lows of humanity. If you have felt it, Jesus has felt it, and you can live through a season to help you lean into that piece of Christ's story and that piece of your own story and find yourself in Christ's life. And it's just such a beautiful reminder of who God created us to be, and that He knows everything we are going through. He has experienced the pain and the joy. And I love seeing myself reflected in Jesus's life and knowing that he is the friend who always understands.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm thinking about this past Holy Week at our church. So, listeners, you've heard me say this a lot, but we go to an Anglican church. So it was at Maundy Thursday, where there's this part at the end of the service where they go from like the Lord's Supper and all that, and then it sort of transitions at the very end to like, oh, we're in Good Friday now. And, this is, I believe, goes back to, this is a very long-standing tradition. One of the Danielles can correct me if I get anything wrong, but the clergy will strip off their strip off all the vestments. We take everything off of the altar at one point, where one of the deacons will like flip over the table for the altar. It's all pretty scary, actually. We actually have to warn our kids in church, hey, buddy, just so you know, it's going to get scary at the end, but it's okay. And I noticed this past year, once that happened, all 4 kids, they're all young, they're all wiggly, they're locked in, right? They are absolutely transfixed about what is happening. So it shows the lows. Then obviously we have Easter and all the noise we make. So it does get it runs the whole gamut. And we expect our kids to follow with everything. And sort of, it almost seems, Danielle Hitchens, I need to specify which Danielle. It almost seems like it's the responsibility we're giving to the kids, right? That like, hey, we expect you to put up with, you're going to experience a lot of joys, but also some lows and some really sad, pretty scary things are going to happen. And we think you can do it. Like, if you notice some benefits from that as well.
I don't know that I have seen fruit from that yet in my own kids. I feel like we're very much in the stage of life of being like, hey, disappointments are a part of life. Let's talk through how we handle those well. Or anger is a thing that we experience. Let's talk about how to handle that well. So we're definitely still like actively discipling our children through that. So I don't know that I can speak specifically to my experience with that with my own children, but certainly for myself, it's always good to remember that the emotions really run the gamut, and I am responsible for stewarding those emotions well, not for not having them or for always having happy ones, but for saying, here's how I feel in this moment. How, like, in which way would it be Christ-like for me to respond? And there's always a touchstone in Christ's life where you can say, like, this is how this feeling can be worked out in a Christ-like manner. Am I always great about doing that in the moment? Not necessarily, but am I good about doing that upon reflection? Most of the time, yes. And hopefully the more and more that I do that, the more and more this practice will shape my automatic response. And that is the goal of all spiritual disciplines, including the church year, is that the more you practice it, the more it shapes your automatic response, the more you are becoming holy as your heavenly Father is holy, and being, displaying the fruit of the Spirit in your life.
Right. And you're also building the skill, because in some ways it is a fruit of the Spirit, but it is something you have to kind of develop over time, but the ability to recognize the presence of Christ in all things, the emotions that feel good, the emotions that don't feel so good, the experiences that feel like very obviously beautiful, and the ones where you have to search for that a little bit more. I think that has been a really great piece of the liturgical calendar for me personally, is learning to recognize the face of Christ in all these different aspects of the human experience, and to know that because I am united to him, there's more to these experiences than what's just on the face of them. Like, I can know God through the things I am feeling and the things I am experiencing. And I think one of the fun things about discipleship as a family is beginning to introduce our kids to that dynamic as Jesus as someone who understands and is giving value to every part of their life, every part of their day, even the parts that at their young age can be hard for them to process. We just really want them to understand his nearness.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so to that point, sort of jumping off what you were saying, Danielle Melema, I was reading through the one of the introductory chapters in your book, Danielle Hitchens, and you were talking about doing liturgy, especially with young children, and you used a term that I thought was very, very apt, and you talked about the earthiness of liturgies when you have young children with you. Why don't you tell us what you mean about that, and just discuss the whole dynamic of trying to do liturgies when you have very young children hanging off of you and making lots of noise?
Yeah, so in this age of digital media, we have all seen the perfectly curated Instagram or other social media feeds. And I feel like the liturgical year can kind of come off like that.
Mhm.
Like you see the soft glowing candles and the family perfectly positioned around the table with the open Bible and the folded hands. And like that is just not how it works. Anybody who has young kids knows like quiet time is usually anything but quiet. Right. So you light the candle and your kids are like, yeah, let's blow those out. And you're reading scripture and they've got like a big question for you about something that is totally unrelated. And there is just like an earthiness to doing things with kids. Like it's very visceral and very real and very not like the, perfectly curated Instagram feed that you're probably picturing for these moments. And I think it's good to remember to take all of these practices in stride, to remember that sometimes things are going to go your way and sometimes they aren't. Like with all things with kids, you have to manage your expectations. If you think it's going to be like a beautiful, quiet 10 minutes while you read this special, like Maundy Thursday passage with your kids and wash their feet, there's going to be water everywhere. They're not going to like the passage you made. Like it's going like, oh my gosh, our Maundy Thursday this year was just a mess, I have to say. There was grape juice on the table. There were lots of complaints about the food. But the thing is, the kids look forward to doing it every year. And every year there are like little snatches of additional meaning that get added. And so in spite of the fact that it was a hard night, and I don't think my husband and I walked away from it feeling very happy, we still know that like that is an experience that sits in the kids' hearts and minds that they continue to look forward to year after year, and that we then get to build on as we've been building on it for the last 2 or 3 years as we've had our special Maundy Thursday evening. We've had a child who goes to bed quite early on Thursdays the last couple of years, so we haven't been able to do a church service yet, but I would love to take them to see the stripping of the altar because it is a really beautiful and dramatic moment. But all this to say, like, just doing anything with kids is earthy, right? Mm-hmm. And liturgy is no different. Like, that's just the way that it's going to be. Don't imagine it's going to be like that lovely curated Instagram photo, but just get your mind right and say, this is worth doing, so I'm going to do it even when it's hard.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. I think we've just had to, I don't think until you're in it do you really even start to realize, like, this is a long game. Like, there is no, like, short-term discipleship, and so we just trust in the Spirit to do what only He can do. I think in our family we try to normalize the wiggliness. We have some kids who, it's just so interesting how their personalities are so different. We have some children that like really like aspire to be really engaged, but are also like very distractible. And sometimes they can be a little.
The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak.
Exactly.
Perfect.
And so we've tried to normalize as a family wiggliness, and sometimes like there will be even disinterest in what we are doing on a morning, and just trying to emphasize, you may feel a lot of different ways over the course of your lifetime about prayer and about reading the Bible and about like celebrating these feasts and observing these traditions. But what we really want to emphasize to them is that, that God will only ever feel one way about you, even as your feelings might ebb and flow over time, which I think can be a pretty natural part of growing in faith. And I think that has helped them, but it's helped us too, to keep our expectations reasonable and to realize, even if things don't go perfectly, like we try again the next day or the next year, if it's like the feast of St. Nicholas, which went 3/4 great, but we had one child who was like just sick and very unhappy. So like, well, we will try again next year. And I think my hope is that what we are communicating, and that is just Christ's worthiness to continue to like come to Him, to engage in this story year after year, and to come before Him as a family day by day. That's our hope.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and
I mean, I think that's great. Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Danielle.
Well, I was just going to say, like, I've got one kid who is just, like, probably borderline ADHD, but also so hard on himself. And so I, like, really resonate with what you were saying. And we have this little liturgy that we do with him because one night he was sobbing about not having done great things for God. And I was like, bud, you're 7, you know?
Oh, I know.
God doesn't call us to do great things. He calls us to do justice and, you know, love mercy and walk humbly. So let's keep things in perspective. But we started asking him, like, what is objectively true about you? And he would say, I am loved by God. And I was like, and what else? I am loved by mom and dad. And we just try to keep bringing him back to, like, here's the thing that's going to be true for your whole life. Nothing you do or don't do can change that. And it's just, I think, such an important message for children to hear that. It's an important message for grownups too. But, you know, it's been so beautiful to disciple him through that and to disciple myself as well, to remind myself, like, you are beloved, he is beloved, and let's work from that foundation into the rest of the growing.
Yeah. And I think that practicing liturgy, like in the macro, really helps you bring it into the micro in those ways where you're saying, like, I mean, liturgy can be expansive and beautiful. And that's one of the things that we love about it. But it also has so much potency in those small moments where you just need to be able to grasp onto, like, a core truth, something extremely focused. I think for children especially, that can be very powerful as well. But I think practicing it in a larger sense trains your heart and your mind and your sight to be able to recognize where it can be a part of the in-between moments.
Yeah.
Yes.
And something related to this too is the way that we as, you know, grown-ups react to the kids and all their earthiness. You know, I think this applies whether you have young kids, whether you're an empty nester, whether you don't have kids, and you know, maybe you have like nieces or nephews, kids of the neighborhood, kids at church. Because one of the things that's been standing out to me lately, when you look at the Gospels, first of all, it's very apparent that little kids thought Jesus was the coolest. So you have to think, like, the sort of person Jesus must have been if little kids consistently keep running up to him because they think he's so cool. And this would happen at least a couple times, right? Where, like, the adults around would get indignant. It's like, Jesus, aren't you going to do anything about these misbehaving kids? You know, they're so rambunctious. And Jesus says, no, you know, y'all should be more like the kids, right? So I think that really helps me in the way to, when you're reacting to, like, you know, the kids having sword fights with the palm branches on Palm Sunday, or, you know, just making a random noise when we're trying to have a quiet family liturgy. And we see this modeled at our church, right? There's so many, like, you know, empty nesters, just other folks who will come up to us afterwards when our kids are yelling and screaming, like, guys, we just love seeing your kids there, all that joy and all that. It's like, oh, okay, well, that's literally the attitude that Jesus had, I think. And it helps all of us, because it's so easy to curate things to make it only seem, you know, all put together and all buttoned up, like only grown-ups are involved. But when you add kids to the mix, things get crazy, and that's part of it.
Yes, but I think we can see those opportunities and those interactions with the children in our congregations as God inviting us into his joy. I think our church does a really beautiful job of that. Like Matt was saying, I remember our oldest lost a tooth in the middle of the communion liturgy. That was not a quiet event in the middle of, like, this solemn, sacred, beautiful moment of our service as we're preparing to come to the table of the Lord Jesus. It was frankly quite gross. And the people around us were just, oh my goodness, it's, I think, the hardest we've laughed in church, at least during the communion liturgy, in a really long time. And there was just such a joy there and a welcoming of the dynamics of being the family of God together. You can expect to experience those things. But I think what you said, Matt, is so true. Like, if we are taking on the attitude of Christ and desire to walk in his ways, we really do see invitations from God through through the children in our midst.
Yeah. And now that we're on the check out the segue, Danielle Nolama.
I'm ready.
All right, so we're talking about the different time periods of life, different phases of life, growing up as kids. Now I want to talk about time in the sense of chronos versus kairos. You again, Danielle Hitchens, you talk about this early on in your book about the different ways of keeping time, and how the way the church keeps time is different from the way we sort of keep time in the rest of the world. So tell us about that and what you believe liturgical calendar can help us with in that regard.
Sure. So I'll define the Latin first, just in case anybody's listening who isn't a Latin scholar. I'm not a Latin scholar either, but I know these two words. Chronos is just what it sounds like, chronological time. It is, the start to finish, the way that things, just sort of normally roll on. Kairos is understood as God's opportune time. And so there's a really interesting interplay between humanity, who is temporal, and God, who is eternal. And you see verses about God's kairos, his perfect time, throughout the scriptures, as well as God's relationship with time. Comments like, a day is as 1,000 years, or 1,000 years is as a day to the Lord. And I think about this with like King Ahaz in the book of Isaiah. I think it's Isaiah 7. When God says to Ahaz, well, ask me for a sign and I'll give you one. And Ahaz says, oh, no, I couldn't bother you with that. And God's like, well, you're bothering me anyway. And here's your sign. Behold, the virgin will conceive and bear a son. And then 700 years later, Ahaz gets his sign. Like, Ahaz did not see that sign, right? This is just how God works. These things take time. He takes time to develop his plan. And, I think the verse in Esther is probably the most quintessential kairos verse for such a time as this, right? When the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his son, born of Mary. And, we see that the way that the Lord works is, and we understand this in our own lives, is not always the way that we want him to work. I mean, how many times have we prayed for things to happen on our own timeline and God has said no, or not yet. And we've wondered, like, why isn't this happening for me right now? And eventually maybe God does answer that prayer and you look back and you go, oh, I see now the experiences I needed to have and the ways that God was working in my heart before he could answer this particular prayer, before I was ready to receive this. And so I think we all experience little pieces of God's kairos, God's opportune time. But as far as the liturgical calendar is concerned, about half the year are celebrations of moments of God's kairos, right? We celebrate Christmas, which is the fullness of time, Christ coming at the incarnation. And Advent is the preparation time for that bit of kairos, the incarnation. And then we celebrate the life of Christ, and then we celebrate Easter, the resurrection. And I find the timing of Christ coming to be so fascinating because God placed Jesus in a particular historical, geographical time and place, right? He wasn't born in South America. He wasn't born in an age of social media. He wasn't born when there was train travel or air travel. Like, it was very local. And I often wonder, like, why was this God's particular kairos? But we are told that that was his opportune time. That was the perfect time, the fulfillment of time for him. And, I have loved seeing the ways that the church has leaned into that over the last 2,000 years, and the ways that the church has developed around God's kairos, these liturgies like the church calendar and other things as well over the last 2,000 years. So, sorry, that was the first half of the year is God's kairos. The second half of the year, which is called ordinary time, season after Pentecost, is a time when we intentionally live into our chronos, and we look for little pieces of God's kairos in our own lives. We are intentionally being the church in the season of ordinary time between June and December. And it's just a beautiful time to see how God is working and God is growing our lives and his spirit in us. And, as I mentioned earlier, like, we see God's timing through our answers to prayer and the ways that he provides for us. But it also just gives us time and space to experience who God is and continue to grow in the life of Christ. Sorry, that was a really long answer.
That was a good answer. It's just the answer I was looking for, and I asked you to define these two Latin terms for different concepts of time. So well handled.
Is there a short way to answer that? I don't think there is.
I don't know. There's an entire chapter in my book on that.
Exactly.
So.
Well, something else you mentioned in your book that I found really interesting is sort of the historic grounding of liturgical traditions. You already talked earlier on about many of the liturgical practices going back, hundreds, thousands of years. But you also mentioned that in some ways this goes back even to ancient Israel, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there was 3 major Jewish conceptions of time. There was the day, which is sunset to sunset. There was the week, so Sabbath to Sabbath. And then there was the year, which was, I think it started with the Feast of Atonement. I'm not great on my Jewish feasts. I'm really sorry. The Feast of Atonement. So I should have looked that one up. But these annual cycles of time, or so the daily, weekly, and annual cycle of time, they each were pointing to a different thing about God and a different experience of God. The reminder that God rests each week was a really important part of ancient Israelite tradition, and something that was really strictly observed for, much of Jewish history, still today even. The annual cycles of time celebrated feasts, 7 annual feasts throughout the year. And each of those traditions was designed to remember a big thing in the life of Israel. So whether that was Passover, the provision of manna while living in tents in the desert, etc., they would gather together as a people and rehearse the story of what God had done for them at these feasts. And so the liturgical year has these same kind of touchstones, remembrance stones, if you will, that help us rehearse the story of what God has done for us in our lives throughout the year, and help us to rehearse this over and over again, not only for ourselves, but in community, with our children, with our families, with our churches. Hopefully, God willing, there's a church celebration of these moments of Kairos, where we can tell each other the story of what God has done for us. And I just think that's such a beautiful tradition.
Yeah. So now let's get to the fun part of the questions now. So, we talked a lot about the liturgical calendar. So again, oh man, I just set myself up for failure here. I'm going to try to rattle off all the different seasons off the top of my head. So we have Ordinary Time, which we're in right now, or the season after Pentecost. Then there's Advent, Christmastide, Epiphany, Lent, sort of Holy Week as its own thing, and then Eastertide. Did I miss anything? He carries on so that there's no chance to be corrected. So of those, Danielle, any that sort of have a particularly fond place in your heart? Any that you look forward to the most?
I love Easter. I grew up in a church where we did not celebrate Lent. We did not practice Lent. And so Easter came and went in one day, just a snap. And there was no preparation like there was for Christmas. There was no post-Easter celebration. It was just this one day that was oh, okay, it's Easter. And then we were done. And it was more about, just some of the fun things that we did on Easter rather than about Easter itself. And as I have leaned into the liturgical year, having the 6 weeks of celebration or preparation with Lent, and then especially the events of Holy Week, Easter feels huge and amazing and so celebratory and so joyful. And then that joy just carries in to the following week and beyond. It's 8 weeks long. Though by the end, I feel like the joy has worn off a little bit. Then we rally again for Pentecost, right? But the octave of Easter, the first 8 days, is just so great. It's so bright. We light lots of candles. We have tons of flowers. We ring lots of bells. We are excited to have our Alleluia banners back up. And so the joy of Easter, I just think, is so wonderful.
I love that. Is there a season that is a little bit more of a struggle for you to fully enter into, whether individually or maybe even as a family?
I actually think Lent is relatively difficult, partly because of just where it falls in the year. Like I've always got 2 kid birthdays during Lent, which means I've given birth twice during Lent, and like it's just always a really busy season, and it frustrates me because I'm like, I really want to like pull back, like I want to not be celebrating things. I want to lean into the austerity of the season, the preparation, the cutting back. And I just never feel like I get to quite lean into Lent the way that I want to. And it's just more of a challenge as a family to decrease the busyness, to try to, pull everybody together, to center ourselves, to practice our prayer and fasting and almsgiving in intentional ways, especially when the kind of outside world around us seems to be just speeding up. It's also really hard to feel Lentish when your kids are like, birthday! So... it's cake and it's ice cream and it's party. This is no Lent. I have to put away my purple table runner and my dead sticks in my vase. And,
yes.
All my Lent cues are on.
Yes. We also have a few feast days scattered throughout Lent, such as family feast days. My birthday is always either in Lent or Eastertide, kind of depending. This year it was on Holy Wednesday. So that was a little
Sorry,
more
sweetheart.
somber.
I hope you're not taking it personally that your birthday was overshadowed.
I'll be okay because in 3 short years, my birthday will be on Resurrection Sunday. So I'm
how wonderful.
Very excited for that. Yeah, it's funny.
Well, I was looking ahead. Sorry, go ahead. I was looking ahead to 2024, and it is a terrible year for Lent and Easter. Like, Lent starts on Valentine's Day. Ash Wednesday is Valentine's Day.
That happened.
I love when that happens. I love it.
No, it's supposed to be a feast day.
Yes.
And my son's birthday is Palm Sunday, and then the Annunciation is Holy Monday. And
my goodness.
My daughter's birthday is 2 days before. And Easter is March 31st, so it is just so early.
That's very early.
That's early.
It's like, oh man, I need to start like mentally preparing for this now. It's going to be a brutal.
So true. Yes.
I know I have the minority view here, but this happened a few years ago too, where Ash Wednesday was on Valentine's Day. I loved it because, everyone else is like hearts and love and rom-coms. I'm like, no, remember, you're going to die one day. I just loved it.
Very countercultural. There you go. Like, do you want to come contemplate your immortality, Valentine?
Here, ashes, put them on your forehead. Remember, you'll become those one day. But to your other point, Danielle, I do feel like, in a lot of circles, there's sort of, you're almost expected to say like, oh, I really love and appreciate the season of Lent for all these reasons that we can give. I think I might just be a natural wimp, but I always dread Lent because giving up stuff is very hard. And I don't even give up that hard of stuff. The most significant thing I give up is sugar. And like 2 weeks in, it's like, how long, oh Lord? How long?
Well, this is why you have to practice Sunday feast days.
Exactly.
Right? So you get total reprieve days.
And I've also tried doing the thing recently. Again, like, I feel like throughout most of Christian history, you're like, are you kidding? That's hard for you? I've tried like fasting on Fridays of Lent, and I'm such a wimp. By like 11:30 in the morning, I'm like, oh man, my flesh is so mortified now. I don't know how I'm going to keep going. But yes, that is very difficult. But on the flip side of it, once Easter comes, I have all these reasons, and it just all culminates in something. Like you said, Danielle, it's not just like one day on a blip and it's gone. It's leading up to something great that lasts for a long time.
And that season of preparation, I feel like we're being hard on Lent here. That season of preparation, I do feel like it's that emptying out for greater filling that we are able to experience through the Easter season, which is 10 days longer than the Lenten season, which I think is a helpful dynamic to remember too. Like this is our story. I think for me, the hardest season is days 9 through 12 of Christmas. I love Christmas. And I wonder if I would feel a little differently about the 12 days of it if we had the guts to really wait to begin our Christmas celebration until, like sundown on Christmas Eve and like lean into being fully in Advent. We're talking no Christmas tree yet. And then transition into it. And then it's like 12 glorious days. But I think for me, that's the season where I most feel, starting at about like day 8 or 9 of Christmas, just like the push and pull of kind of the two narratives that we're living in. Like,
it's January.
The
kids
world,
are back in school.
Right, the world has moved on. Like, we're setting goals. We are, decluttering our homes with a giant black trash bag. Like, there is something in me that really feels pulled in that direction, because I feel like everything in my nature is like, this is it. But it takes a lot of discipline to remain in that place of celebrating that Christ was incarnate, that he came to dwell with us. And even though, like, obviously, like, that should be so easy to celebrate for 12 whole days, I find that celebration is a muscle that you really have to exercise.
Danielle,
like, it is a choice. Yes.
Danielle Mello.
Yes. I'm
Blog
listening.
post idea for you this upcoming January.
Okay.
The discipline of jollity.
Ooh.
That's for free because you're my wife.
People don't use the word jollity enough.
Thank you.
That is just a fun one. You
I
can't say
don't.
it without smiling, so I think it helps. But yeah, I think I most feel the tension of like this opposing narrative that desires to kind of control my story most in those days. But I think I'm getting better at it, and having kids helps.
Yeah. So we are running low on time, but one final question for you, Danielle, and that's just if there's any sort of, maybe lesser known feast day or saint celebration or thing that you do that, it's not as well known, but you find it very meaningful and life-giving. Is there any sort of off the beaten path part of the liturgical calendar that you particularly like?
I mean, I don't know how off the beaten path this is, but I really enjoy Candlemas with my family. This is celebrated on February 2nd. It's a full 6 weeks from Christmas, and it's technically the end of Christmas. So, Danielle, if you really wanted to lean into Christmas, you could leave your tree up to February 2nd.
Yeah. Let's do it!
But we make crepes that day and roll them up so that they look like candles, and we make beeswax candles together. And it's a day for blessing the candle, blessing the light, celebrating Jesus's arrival, the light of the world, in his temple. And we read the story of Simeon and Anna and their recognition of Christ as a baby. And that story has just always meant so much to me, because I want to see Christ however he comes to me, not in the way that I want him to come to me as the much bigger house or the really well-disciplined kids, but however Christ is coming to me in those moments and teaching me. And I love that Simeon and Anna saw the infant Christ when so much of the Jewish world was waiting for a strong man on a horse with a shiny sword to come and radically politically break down Roman rule. These two elderly people in their wisdom looked at the infant Christ and said, "My eyes have seen thy salvation." And, I aspire to be a person of wisdom like Simeon and Anna were. So I just love celebrating this feast day, this fulfillment of the prophecy of the Lord entering into his temple. And then also crepes are amazing, and candles are fun to make.
That's a good day.
And it's just such a great day to enjoy being together as a family and feasting together. And to be perfectly honest, we did Candlemas 2 weeks late this year. So I don't want anybody thinking that I actually can get this stuff done on February 2nd, because sometimes that doesn't happen. Again, the earthiness of liturgy with children. But when we get around to remembering this tradition, it's always really special. So.
Yeah, my family, my grandma's second generation immigrant from Sweden, so we love Santa Lucia. And we were planning on having a big old event this past one. So my daughter and all my little nieces were going to dress up with little candles on their heads, and it was going to be the cutest thing ever. We all got sick, so it didn't work.
All of us.
Oh no, I'm so sorry.
Another lovely thing about the liturgical calendar, there's always, literally always next year. It is okay.
Yes. Always next year. Comes around again.
Exactly. So that is about all the time we have. But before we go, Danielle, tell us where we can find you, where we can find your books, and especially where we can either order or pre-order Sacred Seasons.
Yeah, so you can find me online at catechesisbooks.com. My Instagram handle is at catechesisbooks. If you can't spell catechesis, I'm so sorry. That was the worst marketing decision of all time. Babybeliever.com will get you there. That's the name of my children's book series. Babybeliever.com will get you there. And you'll be able to find Sacred Seasons and the Baby Believer books and a host of other things on my site. And I hope to see you all on the website.
Awesome.
Oh, also, if you're interested in the liturgical year, I have a monthly e-newsletter about something that's happening in the liturgical year that month. So that's a great way to like dip your toe in if you don't want to buy the book.
I subscribe to that email, everybody, and I can attest that it's super good. And it makes some of these lesser known parts and pieces to the liturgical year feel just a little bit more accessible. I think you do a great job of like making it seem meaningful, but also simple. And so I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you again for joining us. Really appreciate it. Thank you to both Danielles. And as y'all can probably tell, listeners, things are winding down at the Anselm Society Digital Pub. Fire's down to embers, customers are trundling home, and you've polished off your final glass. Once again, Believe to See is a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. If you have an extra, 36.2 seconds or so to spare right now, please rate and review the show on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll catch you next time.